Eat, Capone said, pushing the plate of ribs across the table. October 17th, 1931. The Lexington Hotel, Chicago. The dining room was full, thick with smoke and low conversation, the kind of place where deals were made quietly and forgotten loudly. Silverware clinked. Glasses sweated onto white linen. A jazz piano played softly near the bar, just loud enough to make eavesdropping difficult. But everyone in that room knew something was wrong. They all knew it had to do with Table 7. The man sitting across from Al Capone was shaking so badly he could barely keep his fork in his hand. His shoulders were tight, his jaw locked, his eyes refusing to settle anywhere for more than a second. Sweat ran from his hairline down into his collar despite the cool October air. "I said eat," Capone repeated, his voice calm, almost bored. The man's name was Frank Silk Romano. For 4 years, Silk had run the South Side like it belonged to him. Every Wednesday and Saturday night, he sat at Table 7 in the Lexington's private dining room, surrounded by his men, drinking good bourbon and eating the best ribs in Chicago. Politicians nodded to him. Cops looked the other way. New York sent their compliments. Silk wore Italian suits that cost more than most men made in a year. He drove a black Cadillac with white walls and kept a lakefront apartment stocked with cash, liquor, and women who didn't ask questions. 40 men answered to him directly. Another 20 waited for his call. All of it had been built on something that already existed. Something Silk hadn't created. When Al Capone went down, when the trials closed in and the walls tightened, Silk had been his protege, a smart kid from Cicero, good with numbers, better with people. Capone had taught him roots, contacts, judges, and silence. When Capone disappeared into courtrooms and custody, Silk was supposed to keep things steady. For a while, he did. Then the money stopped coming. The messages slowed. The loyalty shifted. According to men who still remembered who really built Chicago, Silk had gone to New York, quietly, carefully. He told them where Capone's warehouses were, which cops had been paid, which trucks mattered. In return, the commission let him keep the South Side. Capone had spent months thinking about that betrayal. Now he was sitting across from it. "I ain't hungry, Al," Silk said finally, forcing a weak smile. "We can talk this out." Capone didn't smile back. He rested one hand on the table. The other drifted slowly toward his waistband, and everyone watching Table 7 understood something at the same time. This wasn't a meeting. It was a reckoning. Silk swallowed hard and finally lifted the fork. His hand shook as he dragged it through the ribs, tearing off a piece more by accident than intent. Sauce smeared across the plate. He raised the fork halfway to his mouth, then stopped. Around them, the room had gone unnaturally still, not silent, just careful. Conversations had thinned to murmurs. Men leaned back in their chairs without realizing it, instinctively creating distance from Table 7. Even the piano player's hands slowed, the notes stretching longer than they should have. Capone watched Silk struggle with the bite. "Go on," he said, "they'll get cold." Silk forced the meat into his mouth and chewed without tasting it. His eyes watered. He nodded as if the food were good, as if this were just another night, just another dinner. Capone reached for his bourbon and took a sip. "You remember the first time you ate here?" Capone asked. Silk blinked. Yeah, I remember." "You were nervous then, too," Capone said. "Didn't know where to sit, didn't know who to look at. You kept your hands under the table the whole time." Silk managed a thin laugh. "I was a nobody back then. Capone nodded. That's right. And I made you somebody. The words landed heavy. Capone leaned forward slightly. Not threatening, not rushed. Just enough to remind Silk that distance was an illusion. When things got hot, Capone continued, I told you one thing. You remember what it was? Silk's jaw tightened. Hold the line. Hold the line, Capone repeated. Not take it, not sell it, hold it. Silk's fork clattered against the plate. I thought you were done, Silk said, the words tumbling out faster now. Everybody did. The feds, New York, even some of our own guys. I was trying to keep something alive. Capone's eyes hardened, but his voice stayed level. You didn't keep it alive, you picked it clean. Silk shook his head desperately. I made deals so the whole thing wouldn't burn. I paid who needed paying. I kept the cops calm. You told them where my warehouses were, Capone cut in. Silk froze. You told them which judges took envelopes, Capone continued. You told them which trucks mattered and which ones were decoys. Silk's mouth opened, then closed. You even told them which men were loyal, Capone said. That part bothered me the most. Silk's shoulders sagged. His voice dropped to a whisper. I didn't think you were coming back. Capone studied him for a long moment. That's the mistake everyone makes, he said. They think time kills things. Capone's hand slid to his waistband. Several men around the room shifted in their seats. One waiter quietly stepped backward toward the kitchen. Another set a tray down and never came back for it. But Capone didn't pull a gun. He pulled out the straight razor. The steel whispered as it opened. Silk's breathing turned shallow and fast. Al, please, we can fix this. I'll give it back. The roots, the money, I'll call New York myself. Capone stood. The chair scraped softly against the floor, loud in the quiet room. You don't give things back to me, Capone said. You just stop having them. One of Silk's men started to rise. A second later, Jack McGurn was there, pressing him back into his chair with a hand like iron. This ain't your conversation, McGurn said. Capone stepped around the table until he was standing directly in front of Silk, close enough now that Silk had to tilt his head up to see him. Stand, Capone said. Silk hesitated. Capone didn't repeat himself. Silk stood, legs trembling, knees barely holding. Capone raised the razor. Not high, just enough. Every man in the room leaned forward without realizing it. This was the moment. The blade moved. The blade flashed once, clean and fast. Silk screamed as the steel kissed his cheek, a thin red line opening where confidence used to live. It wasn't deep. Capone never rushed work. Blood followed the cut slowly, deliberate, running down Silk's face and dripping onto the white tablecloth like punctuation. Silk's knees buckled. Jack McGurn caught him by the collar and held him upright, forcing him to stay on his feet, forcing him to feel it. Capone stepped back and folded the razor with care. The soft click louder than the scream had been. He wiped the blade on a napkin, then slid it back into his pocket like a man putting away a pen. That's enough, Capone said quietly. Silk sobbed now, breath hitching, hands clawing at nothing. His cream-colored suit was ruined, stained dark at the collar, the front, the cuffs. The scar burned already. He knew it would never leave him. Capone leaned in close, close enough that only Silk could hear him. You live, Capone said. That's me being generous. Silk nodded frantically. Thank you, Al. I swear. Capone's voice hardened. Don't swear. You already broke the only oath that mattered. Capone straightened and looked around the room. Every eye was locked on him. "This is how it works," he said, not loud, not soft. "You make money, you pay what you owe. You keep your mouth shut. You don't sell your people to save yourself." No one moved. No one breathed. Capone turned back to Silk. "You got one day," he said. 24 hours to leave Chicago. Take what fits in your hands. Everything else stays." Silk nodded again, tears mixing with blood. "I'll be gone, I swear." Capone didn't answer. He gestured once. McGurn released Silk, who collapsed into the chair behind him, shaking so hard the table rattled. Capone reached for his bourbon and drained the glass. Then he set it down and adjusted his cufflinks. At 9:47 p.m., Al Capone turned and walked out of the Lexington Hotel. No one followed. No one stopped him. Only after the door closed did the room remember how to breathe. Chairs scraped back. Glasses clinked. Someone retched quietly near the wall. The piano player stared at the keys, hands frozen. Silk sat at table 7, bleeding, broken, alive. And every man in that room understood the same thing at the same time. Chicago had changed hands again. Not with bullets, not with speeches, with memory. By midnight, the story was already moving through the city. By dawn, it would belong to everyone. And by the time Silk Romano boarded a train out of town the next afternoon, the scar on his face had already done its job. It told the truth faster than words ever could. Silk was still sitting there when the first waiter finally found the courage to move again. The man approached table 7 with shaking hands and a towel draped uselessly over his arm, stopping 3 steps short when Silk looked up. Blood streaked his face. His eyes were empty now, unfocused, like a man who'd just woken up from a dream he didn't understand yet. "You all right, Mr. Romano?" the waiter asked, already knowing the answer. Silk didn't respond. Jack McGurn leaned in. "Get him some ice, and don't ask questions." The waiter nodded and disappeared. Around the room, conversations restarted in fragments, half-sentences, nervous laughter, lies told too loudly. Men pretended to return to their meals, but no one tasted anything. Every fork scrape sounded wrong. Every glass clinked too sharp. Nobody looked at table 7 directly. They didn't have to. By 10:30, Silk was escorted out through the side entrance, head down, collar pulled high. 2 of his remaining men walked him to a waiting car. Neither spoke. Neither met his eyes. The driver pulled away without waiting for instructions. Across the city, phones rang. Short calls, no names, no explanations. "Route's changing. Hold what you got. Don't move tonight." Men who'd been bold that morning suddenly felt tired. Men who'd been planning expansion decided to stay put. The city tightened like a fist closing slowly instead of swinging. Capone didn't go home right away. He stopped at a warehouse near the river. The kind of place that smelled like oil and old wood. Inside, Johnny Torrio waited with 2 glasses and a bottle already open. Torrio studied Capone's face for a long moment. "You marked him?" Capone nodded once. "That'll travel," Torrio said. "That's the point." Torrio poured the drinks. "You could have ended it." Capone took the glass but didn't drink. Dead men don't remember. Living ones teach. By morning, 3 men who'd been skimming from Capone's old routes found their trucks reassigned. Another discovered his distillery padlocked. A 4th showed up to work and found someone else sitting at his desk, paperwork already signed. No warnings, no explanations. Just reality. By noon, New York heard. They didn't call right away. They waited, measured, counted losses. By evening, a message arrived through a mutual friend. They wanted to talk. Capone read it once, folded it, and set it aside. "Not yet," he said. Chicago wasn't finished remembering. That night, men dreamed differently. Some dreamed of scars. Some dreamed of rooms going quiet. Some woke up convinced they'd heard steel whispering in the dark. And some were on a train heading south. Frankie Silk Romano stared at his reflection in the window glass, watching the city pull away, knowing the hardest part wasn't leaving. It was knowing he'd never really escaped. By the second night, Chicago had adjusted its posture. Not relaxed, never that, but aligned. The kind of alignment that happens when everyone suddenly remembers the same rule at the same time. Capone spent the day moving quietly. No motorcade, no entourage, just short drives, side streets, back doors. He visited 2 bookies, 1 warehouse foreman, and a judge who hadn't returned a call in 6 months. In each place, the conversation was brief. No threats, no raised voices. Just Capone sitting down, looking a man in the eye, and asking questions that didn't need answers. "You still good with me? You still remember who you work for?" Men answered carefully. Those who answered right slept in their own beds that night. Those who didn't were suddenly unavailable. Phones unanswered. Offices empty. Not missing, just no longer present in the structure that mattered. By evening, Capone met with Rika and McGurn in a back room above a closed tailor shop. Maps were spread across the table. Routes marked in pencil. Names circled, crossed out, rewritten. "Southside's settling," Rika said. "North's watching." "They always are," Capone replied. McGurn leaned back in his chair. "Word is some of Silk's boys are thinking about pushing back." Capone didn't look up from the map. "They won't." "How you know?" Capone tapped the pencil once against the paper. "Because they saw his face." That was the part nobody talked about out loud. The scar. It wasn't just what Capone did, it was how public it had been, how controlled, how final, without being fatal. Killing was expected. Marking wasn't. Marking meant memory. Later that night, a small group of men gathered in a basement speakeasy on the west side. They spoke in low voices, glasses untouched. "He let him live," one said. "That's worse," another replied. A third shook his head. "You don't come back from that, not really." Above them, the city hummed. Streetcars rattled. Radios played softly through apartment windows. Life went on, but it moved differently now, like it was aware of being observed. Capone sat alone in his study that night, jacket off, sleeves rolled, reading reports that didn't need to be written down. Names, numbers, small confirmations of order returning. May knocked once and stepped inside. "You all right?" she asked. Capone nodded. "City's loud today." She smiled faintly. "It always is." He looked at her, then back at the window. "Not like this." By the third day, the message reached New York, the way Capone intended. Not through words, but through absence. Money stopped flowing north. Trucks rerouted. A familiar pipeline went dry without explanation. That got their attention. Still, Capone waited, because action had already been taken. This part wasn't about force anymore. It was about letting the weight settle. And Chicago was still feeling it. By the fourth day, men started choosing sides without being asked. They didn't announce it. They didn't make speeches. They just showed up where they were supposed to show up, on time, with the right numbers and the right tone. Envelopes were thicker. Apologies came preloaded with explanations nobody requested. Capone accepted them all the same way, with a nod, nothing more. At a garage on Halstead, 3 former Romano drivers waited beside their trucks, hats off, engines cold. They'd been standing there since morning, afraid to leave and afraid to be seen. Capone arrived just after noon. One of the drivers stepped forward. "We didn't know," he said quickly. "Not about New York, not about the routes." Capone looked at him for a long moment. "You drove the trucks," he said. "You didn't ask questions. That's fine." The man exhaled. "But," Capone continued, "you answer them now." He turned to McGurn. "Give 'em new routes." Relief rippled through the group. Gratitude too loud to voice. Across town, not everyone was adjusting as smoothly. 2 of Romano's lieutenants met in a billiard hall after closing. The lights were dim. The balls sat untouched on the table. "We don't got to take this," one said. "He's one man." The other shook his head. "He's not the man. He's the memory." That ended the conversation. By nightfall, one lieutenant skipped town. The other showed up at Capone's office the next morning alone, pale, hands empty. Capone didn't ask why. He didn't need to. Meanwhile, the newspapers circled the edges, sniffing for blood that never came. No shootouts, no bodies, just strange disappearances and sudden obedience. Editors argued, reporters complained. Nothing sold like chaos, and Capone wasn't giving them any. That was intentional. Violence makes headlines. Control makes systems. On the 5th night, New York finally called. Not a threat, not a demand, an invitation, neutral ground, sit down, terms. Capone listened as Torrio relayed the message, then reached for his coat. "About time," he said. They met in a private room above a restaurant near the river. No windows, 1 table, 3 chairs. New York sent 1 man. Capone brought no entourage. The man spoke carefully. Too carefully. "You've made your point," he said. "Business doesn't need to suffer." Capone leaned back. "Business already suffered. I'm fixing it." The man tried again. Territory, percentages, compromise. Capone let him finish. Then he spoke. "Everything south stays mine," he said. "Every route you touched while I was gone comes back. You leave quietly, and we don't have a problem." Silence. "You're asking a lot," the man said. Capone smiled slightly. "I'm not asking." The meeting ended shortly after. No handshakes, no promises. But when the man left Chicago the next morning, he didn't take anything with him, and that told Capone everything he needed to know. The city wasn't done adjusting yet, but it was getting there. The real work started after New York left. That was the part most men never saw. Capone didn't celebrate. He didn't relax. He didn't assume anything was finished just because another man backed down across a table. Chicago wasn't a room. You couldn't win it with 1 meeting. It was a living thing. And living things tested you when they thought you weren't looking. By the 6th day, Capone started hearing the smaller noises. A bookmaker on the west side who paid light. A warehouse. Foreman who stalled deliveries. A bartender who suddenly forgot which phone to answer first. Little hesitations. Little experiments. Capone let them happen. He wanted to know who still thought they could bend the rules. On the 7th night, he sat in a back room with Rika and McGurn. No maps this time. Just names written on scrap paper. "Not all at once," Capone said. "One at a time." The first man lost his route by morning. No warning. No meeting. He showed up to work and found his locks changed and his trucks reassigned. The second man was visited at home that night Not beaten, not threatened, just visited. He was told who he worked for now and how grateful he should be to still be working at all. The third man never needed a visit. He came in on his own, eyes low, envelope heavy. Capone nodded and sent him away. That's how order spread, not in waves, in pulses. Frankie Silk Romano heard pieces of it as he moved south, station to station, never staying long enough to feel settled. Every city had someone who knew someone. Every bar had a look that lingered too long. Every mirror reminded him that his face would always arrive before his name. The scar had already done more damage than any bullet ever could. Back in Chicago, Capone finally returned to the Lexington. Not to eat, just to sit. Same room, same table numbers, different faces. He ordered coffee. Let it go cold. Watched the room adjust around him the way it had that first night. Quicker now, more practiced. A man approached his table cautiously. "Mr. Capone?" he said. "Didn't know if you remembered me." Capone looked up. He did remember. "You still running numbers on 22nd?" he asked. The man nodded. "You still paying right?" "Yes." Capone gestured to the empty chair. "Then you're fine." The man left lighter than he arrived. Word moved faster after that. Chicago didn't just know Capone was back. It understood what kind of back it was. Not loud, not reckless, permanent. And somewhere deep in the city's spine, the lesson locked into place. This wasn't ending yet. This was consolidation. After consolidation came quiet. Not the fragile quiet that follows violence, but the settled kind. The kind that feels earned. Chicago moved again, steady and predictable, like a machine that had found its proper rhythm. Routes ran when they were supposed to. Payments arrived without reminders. Men stopped testing edges they already knew were sharp. Capone let days pass without interference. He listened more than he spoke. Read reports that didn't need ink. Watched faces instead of numbers. Power, he knew, didn't disappear when you stopped using it. It waited, it observed, it remembered. The city remembered too. The Lexington went back to being a restaurant. Music returned to its corners. Laughter found its way back into the room. But Table 7 was never quite the same. No one requested it anymore. When guests were seated nearby, they lowered their voices without realizing why. Some places hold echoes. Capone returned to routines that had nothing to do with business. Evening walks, cards with friends who'd never betrayed him, long conversations that said less than silence did. He didn't talk about Frankie Romano. He didn't have to. The story was already finished, everywhere it mattered. Frankie drifted from city to city, job to job, always careful, always watching reflections before faces. The scar faded from red to pink to white, but it never softened. People noticed it before they noticed him. Some asked. Most didn't. He learned which was worse. Years passed the way years always do. Quietly, then all at once. New men came up who hadn't been there, who only knew the story as something told late at night, when voices dropped and glasses stayed full. They'd ask, "Did it really happen like that?" And the old ones would nod. "Worse," they'd say. Capone aged into his name, into his history, into the weight that followed him into rooms before he ever arrived. He understood now what few men ever do, that legacy isn't what you build when you're loud. It's what survives when you're gone. The city held, the order stayed. And somewhere deep inside Chicago, the lesson remained intact, waiting patiently for the next man who thought time had erased what memory never forgets. Al Capone walked out of the Lexington Hotel that night just before 10. He didn't look back. He left Frankie Silk Romano bleeding at table 7, left a room full of men who understood they had just witnessed something they would talk about for the rest of their lives. By morning, the story had already spread across Chicago, quietly, accurately, unchanged. That was how real stories moved. By noon the next day, Silk was on a train heading south with nothing but a small bag and a face he'd never recognize again. He never returned to Chicago, not once. The E.T. scar made sure of that. It followed him longer than money ever could, a permanent reminder of the cost of forgetting who made you. Within 72 hours, 3 other men who had helped carve up Capone's territory were gone. Not dead, just removed, relocated with understanding. They took the hint. New York sent word, then a man, then terms. The meeting lasted minutes. Capone's terms were simple. Everything south stayed his. Every route, every house, every name, non-negotiable. New York didn't argue. They'd already measured the cost of resistance and found it too expensive. Within months, Chicago was his again. Not through war, not through chaos, through memory, order, and the kind of power that doesn't need to announce itself. The night at the Lexington became legend. Old-timers still talk about it, about how Capone didn't raise his voice, didn't fire a shot, how he sat a man down, fed him ribs, and reminded an entire city who it belonged to. You can lock a man up. You can steal his money. You can take his territory and convince yourself time has erased him. But if he's the real thing, he comes back. And when he does, he doesn't make threats. He makes examples. That's why Chicago remembered. That's why they never forgot. Al Capone didn't rule with noise. He ruled with certainty. And certainty, once earned, never fades. If this story of power, loyalty, and consequence held your attention, hit that subscribe button. Drop a like if you understand that real kings don't need crowns. They need respect. Share this with someone who knows that betrayal never disappears. It only waits. Al Capone didn't rule Chicago with noise or speeches. He ruled it with certainty, with memory, with the kind of presence that makes a room change before a word is spoken. Men tried to outweight him, tried to outsmart him, tried to convince themselves time had erased what he built. They all learned the same lesson. Capone didn't make threats. He made examples, and he made sure Chicago remembered every single one. What would you have done in Capone's position? Let me know in the comments below.